now.
Perfect. All right, so we can get started. So we'll get started with an introduction from you, Dr. Asaf. So if you want to say your full name, your pronouns, and what is your affiliation with Cal State Fullerton, as well as how long have you been here at the university?
Okay, so I'm Dr. Elise Assaf, she, her pronouns, and what was the third question? My affiliation with what? There was another one in between there.
Yeah, your affiliation with the university. So like, what's your official title? And then
So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communications. Um, I am tenure track faculty member.
okay, awesome. And then so kind of just generally speaking, before we get into the questions, do you want to provide a very brief synopsis of your research, specifically the one that we're focusing on today, which would be your dissertation?
Yeah, so my background is in communications, specifically public relations. And so prior to my doctorate and my doctoral program, I looked very specifically at mass media representations. I started the I started my thesis looking at sports. And so like sports research was actually really interesting to me. There, I considered going into sports media for a time. And then when I decided that I wanted to stick with academia, I was working in PR outside of teaching as an adjunct. And so I was looking for programs, determined that the education program at Chapman was the route I should take. There are not a ton of mass media communications programs here on the West Coast, and I wasn't willing to move. So I thought going into education would be beneficial. It would help me learn how to teach students. So went through that. In that process, because I didn't have an education background, I had to kind of fast forward through a lot of research and learn a lot of things in a short period of time. I ended up doing the concentration. They call them emphasis, but same concept. So my concentration was in disability studies, and there's it could be a long discussion on the difference between special education and disability studies, but basically abbreviated version, disability studies looks at you wanting students to be included in the classroom as opposed to separating students into like a special education classroom. And I thought it was just a really interesting way of looking at things. And there were a number of people in my cohort who were looking more at physical disabilities. Autism was really common for people to be looking at. I was more interested in mental health. I've shared this with my students in the past that I have been diagnosed with various mental health diagnoses, anxiety, depression. A number of my family members have as well. And then my younger brother is schizoaffective. And so when he was going through like his diagnosis process, there were a lot of different diagnoses and labels that were placed on him. And so in that process, like learning about what people's perceptions of someone with schizophrenia or schizoaffective was eye-opening. And so there were a lot of people that would ask, like, is he dangerous? Like, what does he have voices in his head? And like those stereotypes, I think, that you see in film and TV and communicated on other platforms. And so I decided to combine all of that and now look at representations of mental health in mass media.
Awesome. Well, you perfectly answered my first question because I was going to ask what inspired you to start the research. So, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. So to kind of give us more further knowledge of your familiarity with the topic, is there one experience or scenario that kind of, that you can discuss or that you feel comfortable sharing that like really inspired you to be like, this is something that I want to take on for my dissertation and my thesis?
Um, so a dissertation is kind of a unique situation in that there are certain guidelines that you have to follow. And so I don't know while I found the topic interesting, it definitely got changed throughout the process because my committee wanted to see certain things, and they thought that it was like important to follow up with certain avenues of the research as opposed to maybe what I would have focused on. And that's just, whenever you have a committee, you need to follow what they're suggesting because they're the ones that are going to pass or fail you and get you to graduate. So in that sense, I was very much guided by what they thought was beneficial. For example, the study looks at three major newspapers in the United States. Initially, I wanted to include the LA Times, but the one of the committee members, her husband was the health reporter for the LA Times, and so that would have been a conflict of interest, and I would not have been able to use her as a committee member. And at the time, I was already struggling to find committee members that made sense for my research. So, so that, like, in that sense, it had to be amended. In terms of what spurred the research, the initial idea, I did a pilot study for a course, and it looked at headlines. And in that process, I discovered a study that showed that 6 out of 10 people don't read beyond a headline. And so it made me realize how important or how impactful the language in a headline can be in perpetuating stereotypes. And so that was a pilot study, and kind of several research projects have grown from that idea.
Definitely. Okay. So I know you talked a little bit about the three national publications that you selected, and you also talked about it obviously in your dissertation. So why did you only select three and, not four, five, or six? How did you narrow it down to just three?
So part of it, and this is what I recommend to all students, is you have to be really cognizant of the time period that you have when conducting a project, especially if it's something that is for like academic credit or for a course. You only have so much time to complete your data analysis. And so you want to make sure that it is something that is like a data set that is broad enough, wide enough that you have enough data to analyze, but also that it is narrow enough that you can complete it in the time that you have. So that was definitely a major factor in terms of the project. The other thing to realize is that you can always do future studies that expands on it. So that study was looking at three national publications. I had the idea that in the future I could look at regional publications. I can look at international publications. So you can take the same study and amend it with different newspapers or different publications to then do a future study. But for that study specifically, it made sense to do three for the period of time that we chose and like the committee agreed on. There was also something I was going to mention. I can't remember. If it comes back to me, I'll share it.
Awesome. Yeah. And yeah, if it just comes back to you, just feel free to say something and we can stop. Okay, so how did you so this question more so pertains as to like the actual research process. So how did you select your sampling frame? What was some of the criteria that you went about when you were deciding, what to do in terms of your sampling frame for your study?
I think that picking a sample, it's very important that it's something that you communicate. So obviously with research that's done usually at like the undergraduate level, even sometimes at the like master's level, it's going to be convenient sampling. And so it has to be content that you can get your hands on. Again, in the amount of time that you have. So the considerations for that study specifically was that they had to be publicly accessible. So I didn't want to use a platform that the documents could disappear. So I wanted big papers, like widely accessible papers. And so I didn't, this sounds bad, but I didn't want to go through IRB because I had seen a lot of people that hit issues or hit speed bumps, road bumps, whatever, because they went through the IRB process with interviewing people. And I was worried about that. And so I had like a timeline that I needed to stick to with graduating because of like personal life issues and wanting to get a job after graduation. To pay for my education. Having documents that were easily publicly accessible online that I could screen grab and save to then do my research was definitely an important factor for me.
Definitely. Okay. So why did you select qualitative research versus quantitative research? And how did you feel it was more relevant to your study? So what were some of the things compared when you were deciding if you wanted to do qualitative research versus quantitative?
Quantitative was never on the table. That was never an option for me. I have taken several quantitative courses and I just don't get it. My brain cannot compute what I need to do. I don't get, like, I can do basic math. Up until, graduating with my bachelor's, I handled all the math classes that I needed. That wasn't an issue, but something with the algorithms that are required for quantitative research just goes over my head. And I think part of it has to do with the faculty that I took for those classes. And part of it is just maybe my lack of understanding, or maybe lack of interest, to be honest. Maybe if I was more interested in it, I would have dedicated more time to quantitative research. So I, qualitative, I would always lean towards qualitative anyway. But on top of that, I am very much interested in people's stories. I like to dig a little deeper, and I don't think numbers can do that. I think that the words people use are very important and shed a lot of light in terms of what they are thinking and what opinions they hold. It shares a lot about like their ideologies. And so yeah, I think words are powerful and stories are really important. And I very much enjoy understanding the context that is included with qualitative research.
Okay, awesome. And so this is going to be my last question before I hand it off to one of my other group members. So which coding category discussed by Matchin and Meyer was most difficult for you to filter data through connotations, over lexification, or genre of communications?
Oh dear, you're making me really think about these things. It's been a long time. I don't know if any of them were difficult per se. I would argue that genre of communication was a little tougher because I had to follow up with certain labels. So like one of the committee members wasn't sold on using it. And so I had to kind of dig a little deeper in terms of finding like an appropriate coding system for genre of communication. And then that's how I ended up with like the more linguistic coding for that. Over lexicalization, I kind of also had to adapt that one a little bit. So I don't think any of them were difficult. They just required a little bit of extra finessing in terms of the coding process for my study.
Definitely. Okay, well, those were all of my questions, so I'll pass it on to my group member who's going to ask you a few more.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is kind of to go back to what you were saying like earlier, how you were talking about like how you had like a certain time frame to do this whole research. And usually when it comes to research, there's two kind of types of studies that you can do. That's either longitudinal, if I'm pronouncing that right, because it's hard to pronounce, or cross-sectional. Is there a reason why you chose longitudinal?
In all honesty, I've never even heard those terms used with research. So I mean, I'm going to assume longitudinal is like over a period of time.
Over a period, yeah, over a
And
period of time
cross-sectional would
is
be
the all right, like I'm gonna get some like evidence now, and then
Yes.
I'm gonna wait till the end of the
Hmm,
sort of, I guess, research process to look at this evidence, then
got it.
kind of compare the two.
Okay, so you're gonna have
Yeah.
what's it? There's a word I'm thinking of, but okay. So yeah. I mean, I think that having a cross-sectional would require me to be more focused on like an action happening in between. So like a major event happening in terms of like the journalistic research, I would have to have had like, for example, I could have done it like surrounding a political, like a presidential election, right? And so I would have had to take stories from before the election and then compared it to stories after the election. And so those major events have never really played into the type of research that I've done. So I think longitudinally, if that's a word, I just kind of take a certain period of time, and like certain events will come up during that period of time, but I'm less focused on like the before and after effect that event would have, as opposed to just what it emerges during that time period.
All right, thank you so much. So for my next question, because you spent, I want to, or like at least like maybe like 5 pages in the actual dissertation was dedicated discussing this. What was the main reason why you chose the case study approach for this dissertation?
So the case study made sense because I wasn't using people, and so you're kind of, if you're not using human subjects, a lot of the types of studies that you can do kind of fall to the wayside. Like I can't do an ethnography, right? So case study made sense because I was very much focusing on specific publications. And so the other, going back to Dom's question about the number of publications that I chose for being 3, in case studies and qualitative research, you oftentimes want to have 3 to verify. So it's not intended for 3 samples, like 3 cases, but it felt like a good number to like to round out your research, basically to make sure that you're getting enough data. I don't think I answered your question though.
It's all right. I think like because you did kind of go through like the case study itself
Hmm.
and that kind of approach.
Yeah, I think I'll just,
Yeah,
I guess I'll
yeah.
just wrap up the case study part by saying that like, I mean, it's more like I picked the study and then put a label on it, if I'm being completely honest.
Okay.
I didn't start with thinking I was doing a case study and then go.
Right,
And
right.
the only reason it's 5 pages is because a dissertation you have to like go through in depth, like
Okay.
so much information that you would not do in a typical study. So like for a thesis and a dissertation, the committee wants to make sure that you are well versed in research. And so
Right.
it's like you add in a lot of supplemental information that you wouldn't have in a typical study.
Okay. And so would that kind of also go for like kind of like the similar reasons why you chose a content analysis for the kind of research tool, or is there a
No. So
different? Okay.
content analysis is something I very much enjoy doing.
Okay.
So a lot of times content analysis is actually labeled as a quantitative research method, because you're counting the number of times something is said, like what percentage is dedicated to this type of language, that kind of thing. And so like there's some basic numbers that come up in my research, but I find the content analysis, it lends itself well, the label lends itself well to textual analysis, figuring out what phrases and words are being used, who is communicating these things, like who are the quotes attributed to, that kind of stuff. So that's why content analysis was chosen.
All right. Thank you so much. That's kind of what I have for the questions I was going to ask you.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm gonna hand it off to my next group member.
Hello. Okay, so my first question is, what was the process like in developing the research questions for your dissertation?
Oof, okay. I mean, I had my idea. I knew that I wanted to. So when I first started the program, I wasn't sure how my research would fit in with education. I was like, oh, I have to like focus it on K through 12 or higher education. That's not my area of interest, if I'm being quite honest. And I have just no expertise in that. As I went through a couple classes and met with my advisor, she told me that education didn't mean like in a classroom setting. It's basically informing any public, any audience. And so that helped me kind of expand a little bit. So initially I was looking at research, like not for the dissertation, but generally speaking. I thought that because I thought it had to be tied to higher education, I was going to look at student run newspapers on college campuses and the language that was used in those publications. And then when I found out I didn't need to have it so narrow, I expanded it more and tied it back to my communications background. And so, again, tied to that pilot study that I did early on in the program and newspapers. And then in terms of like the actual language of the research question, honestly, that was very much determined by like a group meeting with my committee. It's like I had a sample question and they dissected it like you wouldn't believe. And there were like a couple words that I was like, this isn't a major change. I don't see why we're changing it at all, but they wanted it to be changed. And so, yeah, it was very much determined by the committee. So again, a different style than what you guys are doing for your research projects. But you know, that's just the reality of what that study was like.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. And that leads into the next question of like, what lessons did you learn as a result of the research and like the process?
I think two things. One is making sure that you pick a subject that is interesting enough to you to sustain you. A dissertation takes a year. And while I think some people that are not in academia would think that that's a long time, the reality is that there's studies that take much longer than that. And even when the study is complete, the editing process of like whatever you're drafting, you're submitting it to conferences and publications. It can take them months to review it, and then they send it back and say that they want edits or they want changes. And so this back and forth process can take a really long time. So there's a book chapter that started with my dissertation, and we're now in 2023, and I still haven't, they still haven't finished that process in terms of approving it, asking for edits, and resubmitting it. And so I started this research in 2018. And so it better be something that you're interested in long term, because you're going to be working with it probably for a long time. The other thing is that, you know, specifically for the dissertation, I had my committee members, but outside of that scenario, you still have to be very mindful of who it is that you're writing this content for. So knowing not just the publics that you are hoping to present it to, but like if you're submitting it to a conference, what are those requirements? What are those guidelines? What type of research do they do? How is my research area going to fit with the conference theme that year, or a special publication, like a special edition of a publication? So you have to know all of that information before starting a study. In theory, it'd be great to just do studies that you are interested in that don't really matter. But if you're hoping to advance the field, there are certain parameters that you have to keep in mind in conducting your research moving forward.
Thank you. That was very insightful, and I'm gonna watch this later and be like, okay. As if I'm gonna go and get my doctorate or something. But the next question is, what challenges, aside from the things you've mentioned, what other challenges did you face in conceiving this research?
I don't know if there were other challenges. I mean, I don't know if there were other major challenges. The only thing that I would probably add is that you want to make sure that you are adding, you're adding to the field. And so making sure that there's no other studies that have been done that are the same thing that you are looking at. You want to make sure that there is some difference in the study. So whether you're choosing a different data set, but analyzing the data in the same way, if you're looking at something like 10 years after the first study was done, going to that cross-sectional research, like to make sure that those the points that were made are still relevant. Like you can take the methodology of one study and apply it to yours, but you want to make sure that you're still growing the information.
Thank you. And I have one last one before I
Yeah.
pass it on to Lauren. After completing this research, were there any like valuable critical thinking skills that you gained into understanding how different identities are represented in news media?
I don't know if it was how different identities are represented. I think, well, actually, so there's one committee member that I just hated. I couldn't stand her. And she like was making my life super difficult. And I was so frustrated with her during this process. And now looking back, I realized that she did make me grow, and she like added beneficial insight to the process. And so one of the things that came up that she pushed me in was like the methodology and the way that I was analyzing the information. And that led me to delve deeper into authoritative voices. And so, you know, that the authority of like that we place with certain people is very evident in these journalistic pieces. And so it's like, who is being quoted, who are these quotes being attributed to? That was very insightful and you know, beneficial for me looking at it as a researcher.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're little like robot-y. Okay.
Well, while she's trying to figure out her audio, wait, Lauren, are you good?
I think so, because now it sounds better for me.
Okay, yeah, that's way better.
Okay, sounds good. Might be a little loud as I'm speaking, so I do apologize.
Okay.
But for these questions, I kind of wanted to gain like more insight on like things that you've noticed since you've completed your research rather than looking at the research itself.
Okay.
So at the end of your dissertation, you stated that the study only presents a snapshot in time of 3 national newspapers. And you noted the constant evolving state of the news medium that is newspapers. So since the publication of your study, it said it was in around 2020, have you noticed any like changes from your original findings? And how have the changes in this type of research affected your current perception of the media that we consume?
So I didn't specifically look at, there was a lot of discussion that came up, like ancillary discussions of mental health tied to shootings and mass shootings. And gun violence. And so I wasn't looking at that specifically, but, you know, as a casual observer, because several of the articles did associate those things, I have noticed a decrease in the number of like in the headlines and the content that automatically assumes a mental health diagnosis with someone that is involved or allegedly does a mass shooting. I don't know what the right word would be. So I think that there has been greater awareness in our society, and it is now often associated with very politically heated language from a very specific party that will often connect the mental health and gun violence, whereas I think a lot of other individuals are now looking at other factors in terms of gun violence. The other thing, not in terms of subject matter, but the type of the style of writing, I think, has changed. Obviously, there's a lot more digital, like social media content from newspaper outlets. And so I think that it would be just as, again, as a casual like viewer, it would be interesting to do some sort of study that looked at just the social media posts from these different publications as opposed to the full article, since a lot of people are just consuming it via social media.
Lauren, your audio is still a little.
Do you want
I
to
don't
type?
know.
You can also type the question. I don't know if that would work.
Did your AirPods reconnect to your laptop? That's probably why.
Better?
Yeah, there we go.
I don't know why it keeps on doing that. Anyways, apologies.
That's okay.
But have you seen any other like research done since your publication that's kind of been similar to yours, or would you say that most of it has been through like the social media kind of gaze?
Honestly, I haven't kept up a ton with that area of research for a couple of reasons. One, because I am done with the like dissertation process, I have started to like look into other types of research or other areas of research now that I have a little bit more flexibility. And then the other thing is that like my commitments with being a tenure track faculty member they've just changed. I haven't been able to do as much research as I wanted to do. There's like a teaching and service requirements for my job now that factor into like what time I have to conduct it. So I haven't really looked into it to see what other research is out there on the topic.
Okay, well, my last question is just in general, what advice would you give to people who are consuming the like media through newspapers, social media, and give them advice in regards to like any like misinformation that could be spread towards them? How could they avoid that?
So I teach it in a couple of my classes, and I think that there is a big focus on like content related to digital or to media literacy. And so, there's actually a textbook that I use for COMM 446 has like this 10-step way of determining if something is quote unquote fake news. And so, you want to make sure that it's coming from a trusted publication, that where is that journalist or staff member getting their information from? Are they quoting it from reputable sources? More often than not, they are. Dom, don't worry, I'm not like bashing journalists. But like, there's just so much content online now. And you have a lot of people who have become pseudo journalists and are now putting information on like blogs and social media platforms and all of that stuff. And so making sure that you're very cognizant of who is putting that information out, where they're getting their information from, and the language that's being used. Is it language that is intended to become shared a bunch of times? And so there's a lot of like hyperbole and like heightened language that would cause a reaction and an emotional response, or is it like the straight information that we as consumers maybe should be getting?
Well, thank you. I believe that was it for our questions. I don't know if any of my group members wanted to ask any last things.
Yeah, I had one more thing I actually wanted to add. So I just was kind of thinking, like, as you were talking and, kind of, scratched some icks in my brain that I've been thinking about in terms of research. Because I actually am doing research for my honors thesis as part of like our honors like program requirement to graduate with honors. And I'm doing more qualitative based research for my project in specific. And it's a little daunting, especially as an undergraduate student. I'm not doing a dissertation, and I don't really plan on going to grad school, at least not right after I graduate. And so I was wondering, for students who are wanting to get into research or start off with research, um, what advice would you have for students who, find difficulties in navigating things like content analysis, research methods, literature reviews, and all that stuff, because it can all be a bit kind of scary and daunting. So I was wondering if you had any advice for students who are wanting to branch out into research.
I think going back to like what you're interested in, so like a general topic. So for example, for me, like this kind of next phase of research, I kind of want to delve more into sports, because sports are just interesting to me, something I've played, something I watched as an audience member. And so like sports in general, I'm interested in. Then determining what other things could intersect with that. So obviously I've done research very interested in perceptions of mental health. And so now looking at like mental health and sports. And, there have been a lot of stories lately about athletes stepping down at major tournaments. And so it's like you start to kind of narrow it down from those broad categories. The other part of that is doing some basic background research to determine, has that study already been done, and if it has, how can I change that study or like amend that process so that this is not just copying it and doing the same exact thing, but delving into something a little different so that it is adding to the field. So yeah, I would say that those are the tips that I would give.
Definitely. Okay, so that was all I wanted to add. Anybody else want to add anything before we end? Okay, cool. Armando, you can hit stop recording. And then yeah, that was pretty much all of our questions.